Hello, welcome to Middle School Literature on Monday, September 6th. This is your makeup class, and I'm just going to record right through. You guys are welcome to my schoolroom in my house. These are where I live and what I do. As you can tell, it is a great place for a literature teacher to teach a class. So welcome, and we'll get right on it. I'm going to try to make this as quick as possible. When I ask you to do something, I'd like for you to pause the video and go ahead and get it done, like the grammar starter in just a minute, and then your quiz, and then I'm just going to keep going. So you'll have to pause it in order to have time to do what you need to do. So let's get going with your grammar starter. Here it is. And this is your grammar starter for September 6th. So in your notebook, just go ahead and on your grammar starter pages, put 9-6 where you're doing this grammar starter, no matter what day you're doing this. If it's the Tuesday the 7th or whenever, just put the 9-6 next to this grammar starter as you get it done. And you can pause now and get the grammar starter done. Okay, moving right along. This is your quiz for today. And if you are at home, so I want you to just get out your own piece of paper, put your name and the date and Monday, 12/25 class on your paper, then number 1 through 12, and do your matching, and then put a number 1 below that and answer the question with 2 sentences. Make sure they're really good middle school sentences, and then a number 2 and answer that question with 2 great middle school sentences. And you can pause to do your quiz right now. Okay, moving along. Let's go ahead and go over your homework so that we don't have to do that when you come back to school on the 13th. It'll already be done. So you guys read Finn McCool Faces a Giant, and you'll have filled in that culture, which is the Irish culture. I think that's what it says in the book. I don't have the book right beside me. My daughter actually has it at Hilger doing her homework right now because it's Thursday for me. So in Finn McCool, we have different characters, and I'm sure that you found that we had Finn himself, who I hope you noted was Irish, and he became bigger and stronger than everyone else, and kind of got full of himself. But he also had this unique personality trait of sucking his thumb, which we will talk more about later. Then I'm sure that you saw that we had Unag. Lovely name, right? She's beautiful and smart, and she is Finn's wife. And we're glad that she's there in the story to bring some kind of wisdom to the silliness. And then we have Ben and Donner, who is the Scottish giant, who is bigger and better than Finn. And this is how the story plays out. Oh, and that we have that he is 10 times bigger than Finn. So in Finn, we kind of imagine just this really large man. You know, maybe he's 7.5 feet, or maybe even brushing 8, something a lot bigger than anyone else he knows. But Ben and Donner is actually a giant in this story. So he's 10 times bigger than Finn. And we see there a good picture of someone who gets really full of himself, who thinks he's amazing, and then moves on and finds out he's just a very small fish in a big pond, as the saying goes. So then for your vocabulary, you did have the Giant's Causeway. I think I wrote all of these down somewhere, which your book says is a path-like outcrop on the coast of Northern Ireland. And you see a picture of it right here on my screen. So this is this is one of those examples of a myth where someone came up with this myth to explain something they couldn't understand. Here is this amazing rock formation on the Irish coast, and they really just couldn't understand um, what was going on here. Was this formed? Why was it formed? How are these rocks so flat, like stepping stones? And so this story was born of that causeway. And then you had the word curd. I think this is the story that curd came from, which is just the nasty idea of a solid glob of curdled milk, just like soured milk. Um, and you could see that definition in your book. All right, so I think that was from this story. And then hopefully you found some facts about Irish culture. We can go over that one part of this slide when we come back to class on the 13th. I'd like to hear what you'd found. So please make sure you find at least one good fact about the culture to share with the class when we come back. And then the lesson that you can learn. There are many, and I hope you picked some of those out, but I think the main one is just not to think you're the biggest and the best, because there's probably someone somewhere who's bigger and better. I think I felt this particularly when I came to Covenant College. I was like, you know, one of the smartest kids in my class in my tiny little country Alabama school, and also kind of the Christian, the one that everybody turned to and said, I've got a Christian question I need to ask Olivia. And then I showed up at Covenant, and I was somewhere in the middle as far as smarts go, and I was definitely not the only Christian anymore. And it was definitely a shift in the way I felt about life. So hopefully you maybe a good way to say this is straight from the Bible, the best way to say anything, right? So pride goes before what? A fall, right? So if you are proud, you're probably going to mess up and something terrible is going to happen. So watch out for that in life. And maybe this is another one of those stories that helps us tell that. And then text to text is another place I'd like to hear from you guys on the 13th. So you can save those for me. You've probably heard other stories about giants and other stories, maybe about Irish or Scottish heroes that you can share with us. But this is pretty good for now. We've got a lot of these filled in. And I like the fact that we don't have to go over all of it in the next class. So let's move on to Thor and Loki. And I know that you all know a lot about Thor and Loki. Those of you who've seen the Avengers have seen one representation of Thor and Loki. And I wanted to find some pictures that were very different from the Avengers version so that you could see. Thor and Loki too have been in the arts, like people have artists have painted them for a long time. Like it's not Avengers, they're not giving you something new. It's just one version. So here you have Thor with his hammer, and he's got his lightning coming. In these stories, he's often said to be riding in a chariot pulled by goats. Go figure, just what he was. And then in this picture, you see Loki represented more like a court gesture. And I think that would be kind of a normal way that in medieval times he would have been thought of, especially in England. All right, so we can go to describing the three characters, which that's easy enough. We've got Thor, who is the thunder god with the hammer. And again, we know when we're talking about myths, we're not talking about this as a religion. This is we're talking about this myth as a story, and we can enjoy it as a story. And then Loki is the trickster god, as you guys all know. And then we can look at, let's see. Oop. Yeah, I don't want to do that yet. We'll go back to this. So Then you have, I guess, the main other character, it would be the Giant King. And, he is Loki's enemy or Thor's enemy. And the book does a good job explaining him as being cruel and hideous. But then I do think he kind of redeems himself in the end when he explains how this happens. And he is the trickster, and um, that's why Thor feels like he's an enemy. And I don't like it when it does that. There we go. All right, so then we can go on to, oh, and of course we have the old granny and the cat and the I guess you wouldn't call Mead a character, but those are also, if you wanted to add in characters, the granny and the cat could be them. All right, and then we have mead is one of your vocabulary. It's a drink made from fermented honey, and it is an alcoholic drink, but maybe it could have levels of alcoholic content. So maybe not all of the mead was super alcoholic. And then we have the drinking horn, which I'm sure you can get an idea. It's just an animal's horn that is used for drinking. And in some of the stories, these are giants. So in some of the stories, the drinking horn is really huge. Like Thor could almost get inside of it. And so he's drinking this, and spoiler alert, what he's drinking is supplied by the ocean. So it's supposed to be like mead supplied by the limitless ocean. And so it never ends. He can never get to the bottom of the drinking horn, but that's easy enough to imagine. Um, I, I think maybe Asgard was also in dark print in your book, and Asgard is supposed to be this place where the gods live. So, and we're talking about Norse mythology, which is, from these peoples that you see on this little tiny map. This is where the Norse peoples ended up, and all of these myths that we have about Thor and Loki and Asgard come from these peoples. Again, save your facts. I want to hear them when you come back to class. And the lesson is clearly stated at the end of the book, and it is a similar lesson, like pride goes before a fall. Don't think um, that you're strong enough. And also, I guess the lesson at the very end is that wits are better than strength. So, and that again is like being smart. Um, and that could be a lesson from the last story too. Wits are better than strength. So, save your text to text connections. We'll go over those. I do want to go and answer the questions really quick from the homework. So you learn how Finn McCool sucks his thumb because of that story with the salmon that he cooked for his teacher, and it was the salmon of wisdom, and he burned his thumb and he put it in his mouth to cool it off, and he got just a little bit of the wisdom from the salmon. Don't ask me how the salmon has wisdom, but that's the way it works. So whenever he sucks his thumb, he's a little bit wiser. Not so wise as to know not to build a pathway for his enemy to get to him. But anyway, and then Benandaughter is that giant from Scotland that we talked about. Unag is the wife of Finn, and she's beautiful and wise. And though her name doesn't really bring up beautiful and wise to me, but and then Finn gets from Ireland to Scotland on this pathway that he creates because he's so large and so strong. He's able to bring these stones and somehow make this pathway. And that pathway is destroyed when Benandonner's mad and leaves in a huff. And only the little part, the Giant's Causeway, is left. From that pathway, and that's why it's still there. So that's the origin story of that. And then to Thor, why is Thor the sworn enemy of the frost giants? Because they're tricksters, and they just seem to be the bane of his existence. Everywhere he goes, he runs into things that they throw him that he can't overcome. He's like the one they're like the one group that proved to him he's not as big and strong as he thinks he is. And then he's challenged to fight the granny, to pick up the cat, and to drink the mead, which all sound very simple to him at the beginning and should be simple, except in the end we have the Giant King admitting that they used magic to win out. So um, interesting stories. And like we've talked about before, these stories have been told over and over and over in different ways. These are just, um, one way of retelling them. So, in many literature classes, you are going to talk about literary elements. These are um, the way that we put words together, the way that we weave our magic. This is almost kind of like the different kinds of spells. If we figure that words are magic, then these are our spells for them. I think that literary elements can be put into three different categories, and these categories overlap. Story elements are usually things like that I'm sure you've talked about before. Um, they're like plot and characters and setting. So if you want to learn about a story, then I might ask you, or if I want to learn about a story that you've read, I might ask you, so what's the plot? Who are the characters? What's the setting? We might talk about the climax. What happened at the most exciting part of the story? What is that? Um, so those are story elements, and we can define those. But I think you guys probably have heard about those before. And then poetic elements are more what you see here on this list, and that is things that make a poem a poem. So, and that can be different for different cultures, and also you can use none of them and still write a poem. Um, but for our purposes, they're going to be things like alliteration and rhyme and repetition, um, uh, things where we're using the word and personification. We're using the words um, in a slightly different way than you would in our common vernacular, just in talking. And then, so I would consider alliteration, rhyme, repetition. In Hebrew poetry, repetition is this is the thing that makes a poem is repetition. So if you ever are reading especially in the Old Testament, and you are like, why are they repeating this over and over? That's because that's their highest form of poetry. In English, I would say it's more rhyme. Like if you hear something rhyming, you're like, oh, it must be a poem. Um, but in Hebrew, it's repetition, and I really am super fond of alliteration. We also have things like assonance, that's just repeating the inside of a word, the sound of a word. Um, we have caesuras, like pauses in the poetry, the way that it flows. We have rhythm, so I guess that's part of rhythm is the caesura. Um, so these are all poetic elements that come together to make a poem. Then you have figurative language, which is really what I wanted to talk about today. And that is the way that it really is more of those lies that we talked about the first class. It's saying one thing and meaning something else. And we all do it. We all are very familiar with this form of language. Um, I might call flashback a part of story elements really quick. Okay, so figurative language is personification. This is when we talk about a thing as if it's a person. I like to do this with my garden. I talk about my plants, like my okra plants, like, they're getting bigger. They're like they're little people to me. Look at him. He's got good leaves. I'm so proud of him. He's got 4 okras on him today. If I do this, then I'm using personification. And then you guys are very familiar with metaphors, um, similes, metaphors and similes. And these are metaphors are when you compare one thing to another without using like or as, and similes use like or as. Um,
I wish I could draw on the screen, but I don't have my pen ready to do that. But um, when I was little, my teacher drew this smiley face and put the word simile inside of it to try to remind me. And then, oh, it was the smile, and then you have like and as. So to remember, like simile is like and as. Um, and that's just, the wind is blowing as hard as, I don't know, the as fiercely as a hurricane. As long as I use as twice or like once, then it's a simile. We also have more that maybe you haven't heard of as much. We have irony. Um, and this is more, you use this all the time, right? Sarcasm is a form of irony. So our expression means something other than the literal meaning of the individual words. So, irony, oh, that's idiom. The use of words to convey a meaning using language normally means the opposite. Okay, so we do this with sarcasm. On the video that I showed you at the beginning of class, um, the first day it said, I really like your post. It's fantastic. And then it said that's sarcasm. So because the blog post isn't. So we say one thing and we mean the other. Like, yeah, I feel really great. And we mean, no, I feel awful. And then an oxymoron, that would be more of a poetic element. That's when we use contradictory words side by side. We do this more by accident sometimes, but they have some examples on there: jumbo shrimp and pretty ugly. You can't be pretty ugly because pretty means something different. A pun could be a form of figurative language. So that's when we use one word that means several things, and all of those meanings kind of have to do with the joke you're telling or what you're working on. Then imagery, I would fit in poetic elements as well as in figurative language. This is, I guess I would put this more in poetic elements. Imagery is when you're saying things that could go with the five senses. So these words, these poetic and literary elements fit into different categories. We will talk about each one more. I did want you to learn more about figurative language today, so I'm going to play this video for you. And I really like this as an introduction. You know me, I'm always talking about why we should read books, why we should read fiction, why these stories are so important. And this video touches on that as well as the different figurative language, a little bit of figurative language. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of my little picture and present this to you on the big screen. We'll see how that works.
Hi, I'm John Green, and this is Crash Course. Can we get these books to roll in the future? It doesn't feel like Crash Course unless there's a roll-in. Today, before we begin our mini-series on reading and writing in English, we're going to discuss how to read and why. So if you watched our series on world history, you'll no doubt remember that writing and the ability to read it are so-called markers of civilization. Now that's a really problematic idea. I mean, for one thing, great stories can have great lives in the oral tradition, like one of my favorite books, Mules and Men by Zora Neale Hurston, was a collection of folklore that lived in the oral tradition until Zora Neale Hurston wrote it down. And the same can be said for another of my favorite books, The Odyssey. But we privilege reading and writing because they allow us to communicate directly and transparently with people who live very far away from us, and they also allow us to kind of hear the voices of the dead. I mean, I don't want to get all liberal artsy on you, but I do want to make this clear. For me, stories are about communication. We didn't invent grammar so that your life would be miserable in grade school as you attempted to learn what the marquez a preposition is. By the way, on this program, I will be inserting names of my favorite writers when I would otherwise insert curse words. We invented grammar because without prepositions, we couldn't describe what it's like to fly through a cloud or jump over a puddle or Faulkner beneath the stars. Like right now, if I'm doing my job and you're doing your job, you aren't thinking about the fact that I'm contorting my mouth and tongue and vocal cords to create sounds that then exist as ideas in your brain. It's just happening. But if my language gets confusing, if I parle en français, or incorrect word order use, or ixpe, inye, igpe, atenle, then I erect a barrier between you and me. You and I? You and me. Writing, or at least good writing, is an outgrowth of that urge to use language to communicate complex ideas and experiences between people. And that's true whether you're reading Shakespeare or bad vampire fiction. Reading is always an act of empathy. It's always an imagining of what it's like to be someone else. So when Shakespeare uses iambic pentameter or Salinger uses a red hunting cap, they aren't doing this so that your English teachers will have something to torture you with. They're doing it, at least if they're doing it on purpose, so the story can have a bigger and better life in your mind. But for the record, the question of whether they're doing it on purpose is not a very interesting question. Oh, we're still doing open letters? An open letter to authorial intent. But first, let's see what's in the secret compartment today. Oh, it's a boat beating against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. Dear authorial intent, as an author, let me speak to you directly. You don't matter! Look, I'm not willing to go as far as the postmodernists and say that the author is dead, because that would make me very nervous. However, the author is not that important. Whether an author intended a symbolic resonance to exist in her book is irrelevant. All that matters is whether it's there, because the book does not exist for the benefit of the author. The book exists for the benefit of you. If we as readers can have a bigger and richer experience with the world as a result of reading a symbol, and that symbol wasn't intended by the author, we still win! Yes, inevitably, reading is a conversation between an author and a reader. But give yourself some power in that conversation, reader. Go out there and make a world! Best wishes, John Green. Here's the thing. It is extremely hard to get other people to feel what we are feeling. Like, you may have experienced this in your own life. Say my college girlfriend broke up with me, and she did. I want to explain what I'm feeling to my best friend in the entire world, so I say, I am completely obliterated. My heart is broken. In fact, my heart is shattered into a million pieces. Right, so a few things are going on here. First, in excellent news, my heart has not been shattered into a million pieces. It is pumping blood in precisely the same way that it did before the breakup. Secondly, in further good news, I am not totally obliterated. Total obliteration of me would look like this. I'm using the techniques of hyperbole in the case of obliteration and metaphor in the case of my broken heart to try to describe the things that are happening inside of me. But because I'm not using particularly compelling or original figurative language, my friend may struggle to empathize with me. And this is my best friend in the entire world. Now imagine that you're trying to communicate far more complicated and nuanced experiences and emotions, and instead of just trying to communicate them to your best friend, you're trying to talk to strangers, some of whom may live very far away, and in fact live centuries after your death. Not only that, but instead of this happening during a pleasant conversation, they are reading your dry, dead text on a page. So they can't hear your intonation or see the tears dripping from your cheeks, even though it turns out that this breakup is going to be one of the best things that ever happened to you. So that is the challenge that Shakespeare faces, and it's also the challenge that you face whenever you write for an audience, whether it's a novel or a pedantic YouTube comment about the accuracy of our Gallifreyan. Hush, this is fantastic Gallifreyan. So I'm going to ask you to read critically, to look closely at a text and pay attention to the subtle ways the author is trying to communicate the full complexity of human experience. But I'm not asking you to go symbol hunting because reading is supposed to be some treasure map in which you discover symbols, write them down, and then get an A in class. I'm asking you to read critically because by understanding language, you will, 1, have a fuller understanding of lives other than your own, which 2, will help you to be more empathetic, and thereby 3, help you to avoid getting dumped by that young woman in the first place. Although Although more importantly, 4, reading critically and attentively can give you the linguistic tools to share your own story with more precision. And that will help people to understand your joy and your heartbreak, yes, but it will also be helpful in many other ways, like when you are trying to convince the company to move forward with your fourth quarter strategy or whatever it is that people with real jobs do. Reading thoughtfully gives us better tools to explain corporate profits and broken hearts, and it also connects us to each other. The real reason the green light in The Great Gatsby is such a wonderful symbol is because we all know what it's like to be outside in the evening staring off into the distance at a future that may never be ours. We've all felt that stomach-churning mix of yearning and ambition that Gatsby feels as he stares out at that green light across the harbor. And by knowing what it's like to be Gatsby, we learn more about those around us, those who came before us, and we learn more about ourselves. So over the next few weeks, we'll be reading not just Gatsby, but also Romeo and Juliet, some poetry by Emily Dickinson, and The Catcher in the Rye. There are links to get all of these books in the video info below. We'll begin with Romeo and Juliet next week. I'll see you then. Crash Course.
Okay, we're not going to be reading those books, but I did want you to hear what he said about language and why we use it and why we read, why we need to be able to use these different literary elements in our writing. It's partly one of those reasons why fiction is so important, and that is that it helps us to have empathy with others. So if you would, I want you to pause the video and rewind and look for those. He actually gave you 4 reasons why we should read thoughtfully. I want you to write down the number 1, number 2, and number 4. You don't have to write the one down about, not having the breakup in the first place. But write down number 1 and number 2 and number 4. And then he used metaphor and he used hyperbole as examples of figurative language that help us understand what the writer is saying, and we help us to communicate what we're trying to say. I think I told you guys this before, that one of my goals in life is to help you communicate with the people that you have to communicate with in a way that they can understand you. And sometimes that means grammar, and sometimes it means being able to use figurative language appropriately. We want to use metaphors and similes in a way that help people understand what's going on and what we're trying to say. So we'll be practicing with these. I know you've got a story to write this week, so I'm not going to actually give you, let's see. I don't think I'm giving you a whole lot of grammar homework for this week because of your story that you have to turn in. So this would be homework from the 6th. You guys see it? Homework from the 6th and the 8th. So let's take a look at it. I wanted you, I'm gonna change that up a little bit for you guys. I won't have you write grammar sentences this time since you're focusing on your story that you're writing. But I would love it if you would try to put in some kind of hyperbole or some kind of simile or metaphor into your story. I want to be able to identify, to have empathy with your characters. I want these things to be true for you when you're writing for me, as for Shakespeare when he's writing for, all of history to read later on what he's writing. So think about those things as you're writing. And literary elements are very helpful when we talk about genre. I told you guys that we would pull this chart back out. If you have it in front of you, you can pull it out and take a look at it. When we talk about nonfiction, it's very helpful to have very clear language. We don't want to have a whole lot of figurative language because, in some, like in textbooks and those kinds of in scientific journals, we don't want to have a huge amount of figurative language because that gets us really off topic. But maybe in your journal, if you're writing, you want to explain how something feels, and it's real, but you can compare it to something that's not real. So to help get down that feeling. And a lot of times I think we write journals for ourselves so that later on we can read it and understand how we felt way back then. and maybe using some of this figurative language could help. But in fiction, it is super helpful to have these figurative language options so that these can be explained. So when we use fiction, we are often pulling on all of these things, not as much as of the poetic elements, but definitely when we read fiction, we're using imagery. So somewhere beside where you wrote all those kinds of different kinds of fiction, please write, in fiction, we see imagery, we see metaphors and similes, we see irony, we see puns, and we see hyperbole. And of course, we see all of these story elements with plot, character setting, climax, flashback, those kinds of things. So as you're reading in your myth book, in your mythology book, you can look for these things, but it definitely happens with your with all of the different kinds of fiction, with fantasy and with sci-fi and with realistic. If we didn't have it, we would have a hard time identifying with the characters. So if you need more time to write those things down, please feel free to pause the video. And we're going to go on to how to use a comma. So this is a really helpful visual, I think, for using commas with fanboys, which is the for, and, nor, but, yet, or so. I think I got them out of order, but I really like this as a visual. So we're switching gears and doing our grammar. I'm going to present this video and then sum it up really quickly for you guys and get finished.
Commas are tricky things, especially when subordinates and conjunctions are involved. If you can remember a few basic rules, a simple law of physics, and some common scenarios, you will be able to use commas correctly. I like to think of the different parts of our sentence as characters. Let's meet a few of them. The tiny conjunctions, the mighty subordinates, and the clever comma. Conjunctions are small and nimble. They are words that connect clauses, words, and phrases. You can easily remember the conjunctions by remembering the acronym FANBOYS. The conjunctions are for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. Because they're so small, more often than not, they require the help of a comma, but not always. Subordinates, on the other hand, are the WWE heavyweight champions of sentences. They are words that connect two unequal things, dependent and independent clauses. Subordinates make it very clear what is being prioritized in a sentence. Commonly used subordinates are although, because, before, however, unless, and even though. Because subordinates are all about power, they can do a lot of heavy lifting by themselves. But, of course, sometimes even the strongest among us need some help from our clever friends. Because our clever comma is so nice, she often roams her neighborhood looking for some community service to do. Today, as soon as she leaves her house, she sees a subordinate lifting the weight of 2 complete sentences, one on each arm. Bartholomew loves engaging in political debate, even though he usually loses. The comma asks the subordinate if he needs help. Well, we know that subordinates are the WWE heavyweight champions of sentences. They can easily hold the weight of these 2 complete sentences because they are distributed evenly on both arms. So, when the comma asks if it can help, the subordinate is appalled at the idea of needing assistance. No thanks. Maybe next time. So the comma continues on. Soon, she sees a couple of subordinates attempting to lift the weight of sentences directly in front of themselves. Even though Bartholomew loves to sing, he never sings in front of others. The comma asks the subordinates if they need help. They might not want to admit it, but this time the subordinates do need help. Complete sentences weigh quite a bit. Simple physics tells us that it's easier to balance heavy objects if the weight is evenly distributed. So while the subordinates are quite capable of balancing 2 complete sentences when carrying the weight on both sides, they're having trouble picking just one up. The comma rushes over to help the struggling subordinates. But how will she help? When subordinates begin sentences, the comma will place herself directly after the first thought or complete sentence. After helping the subordinates, our comma heroine continues on and spots a conjunction holding the weight of 2 complete sentences. Bartholomew was accepted into the University of Chicago, and he is on the wait list for Stanford University. The comma asks the conjunction if he needs help. Of course he does. Hurry! The comma rushes and places itself before the conjunction. Fanboys aren't as militant as subordinates. For this reason, the commas don't have to fall in line behind the fanboys. Fanboys are courteous creatures. They allow the comma to go ahead of them. Helping others is hard work. On her way home, our comma sees a conjunction holding up the weight of a complete sentence and a fragment sentence. Bartholomew is going to major in molecular biology, or interpretive dance. The now exhausted comma asks the conjunction if he needs help lifting the items. This is one of the rare occasions where a conjunction doesn't need the help of a comma. The conjunction assures the comma that help isn't needed, which is good for the comma, because by now all it wants to do is go home and rest up for another day of vigilant sentence constructing.
All right, so you get an idea of how to use commas, and hopefully it's more helpful because this creator used personification for the subordinates and the conjunctions and the comma itself. So I want you to go back in the video and make a note page with the word commas at the top. And I want you to copy down the definition of conjunctions and the fanboys, the FANBOYS, the 7 conjunctions, and then copy down the definition of subordinates, or sometimes they're called subordinate conjunctions, and give me some examples of subordinates like even though. So make sure you have that on a note page. I'll check that when you come back to class to make sure you have your notes on commas, and go ahead and pause me and rewind so that you can see that. And those will be the things that we have learned today about commas, those about the subordinates and the conjunctions. All right, so good work. Don't forget you have homework. I'm going to get rid of this grammar homework. We'll put that off for next time. And you'll just be doing your 2 stories, Maui Slows the Sun and Defining Responsibility, Gluskabe and the Wind Eagle and Defining Ravine, and then answering your questions on the back. But your big thing this week is to finish your original myth. It is due next week on September 13th. Don't forget to do your journal, but obviously I'm not going to be looking at that. It doesn't get graded until October 20th. It might be 18th for you guys. All right, so I am going to sign off on this. I hope you guys were able to learn a few things about the literary and poetic elements and about commas, and I will see you guys on the 13th. Goodbye.